Author's Notes on the Brass Man by John Borneman. The novella that became The Brass Man began with a short story. I was involved in a group of online fantasy and science fiction writers who spent their spare time helping review each other's work. As a new writer, this online work group was invaluable. What is now called A Spot of Brass was my first story, workshopped and published. At the time, I was building a muzzle-loading rifle from a kit, and the process involved a lot of polishing of brass pieces that were part of the rifle. I guess doing that work, coupled with thinking about a story to write, led me to think the question, I bet a robot made out of brass would have to spend a lot of time cleaning themselves. From that thought came the line, a brass man sat on the shore, polishing himself to perfection. Of course, I had to put my brass robot on an ocean shore just to make his life that much more difficult. And from that first line, quickly came this little 1,500-word short story. From that story, I asked myself, why was this brass man on the beach in the first place? So I wrote A Wall of Brass, which takes us back in time to how he ended up there. Then I asked myself, what is the origin of the characters in A Wall of Brass? That's where A Melody of Brass came from, and it was written. All three of these stories were published between 2002 and 2005 in the paper magazine Andromeda Spaceway's In-Flight magazine. This magazine was, and I think still is, run by a group of science fiction fantasy writers in Australia with a tight budget and very good taste in fiction, if I do say so myself. I cannot express how cool it felt to hold that issue containing The Brass Man, my first real published story, in my hands. From there I asked myself, were the brass men always on this island of Aku? So I wrote A Scent of Brass, and admittedly, this is one of my favorites. It took another 20 years to finish the whole novella and complete the story. I knew that I wanted to spring forward in time to what happened after A Spot of Brass. And during those 20 years, and no, I'm no Stephen King, I write slow, I kept thinking about this last part of the story. Many ideas and paths were explored in my mind, and a few even made it to the writing stage. But finally, inspiration hit, and I wrote and finished Over the Unpolished Sea in around 2020. And since this whole novella was written in a crazy order, I wrote the prologue last. What was fascinating to me was that as I wrote these stories, a whole system of theology/mythology appeared in the stories. I can only assume that something deep inside that wrestles with war and survival came out of me and inserted itself onto that page. So a last note. All writers get help in various forms from various people, but I would not have finished this story without my grandson, Sean Borneman. He read the previous stories and my drafts of Over the Unpolished Sea and gave me suggestions, and more importantly, he gave me support and encouragement. Thanks, bud. Of course, The Brass Man and Other Stories is available on Amazon as a Kindle book and as a print version. Go search for it. Buy one, please. However, if you are not a reader, I do hope you enjoy this audio version of the tale. I'm not a professional voice actor, so I hope that what I lack in vocal ability is compensated for by the fact that you are hearing the author read his own work. John Borneman, February 2025, Nashville, Indiana. A Spot of Brass. A brass man sat on the shore, polishing himself to perfection. Laid about him on the sand were his dearest possessions, the large flat piece of rough stone, a piece of fine metal wool, and finally his secret weapon against tarnish, a nearly empty tube of polish, and a piece of soft white leather. The brass man worked away at a particularly nasty scratch on his left thigh. He had a time-tested method for dealing with these types of scratches, and he was well into his four-part procedure. The first part involved the use of the stone. He had spent all morning working the dark, rough stone over the scratched area, first up and down from ground to sky, and then back and forth from hip to knee. All during part one, the sun had been steadily climbing behind him and now shone directly on the middle of his back. Being a brass man, he had very little awareness of the sun's position or of its heat on his surface, but Being a vain brass man, he was fully aware of the sun's light shining on the spot. He could reach every part of his body with the 4-part procedure except one. The spot, located in the small of his back, was immune to his efforts. Although quite flexible for a brass man, neither his left arm nor his right arm could reach quite far enough behind him to apply the stone or his metal wool to that one place. The spot defied all his best efforts. Sometimes he imagined that the spot had turned green from corrosion. He imagined it growing and eating its way inwards to eventually become a hole. However, when he thought of holes, he became lightheaded and had to go patrol the beach to clear his mind. Picking up the metal wool, he applied himself to part 2 of his 4-part procedure with intensity and concentration. He noted with satisfaction that the scratch on his leg was disappearing nicely. As with all scratches, 10% of the effort eliminated the scratch, and 90% of the effort eliminated the smaller scratches created from the polishing process. Rubbing lightly up and down from ground to sky, and then back and forth from hip to knee, he continued working as the sun zipped overhead, fell into the ocean, and popped back up again behind him. Laying the metal wool next to him on the sand, the brass man surveyed his work. Instead of the 4-inch-long disfigurement, he saw a smooth matte circle surrounded by the gleaming golden mirror of the rest of his leg. My, but it's hard being a brass man, he thought. Being a brass man, the pun was lost on him. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed a movement off to his left, far down the beach towards the point of land. He'd never been to that point of land and didn't plan on ever going. He wasn't assigned to that section of the beach. Using a quick, continuous motion, he reached down to his right, picked up a laser rifle, aimed at the movement, and fired. The movement turned into a puff of smoke, which is what he did. He turned movement into smoke. His original instructions had been very simple. Keep the beach clear of creatures. Since creatures move, things that move must be creatures. Over the course of his memory, which was as long as his patience, he had turned thousands of movements into puffs of smoke. He set the long laser rifle down onto the sand, intending to begin the 3rd part of his 4-part procedure. He hesitated and studied the rifle next to him. The long barrel reminded him of the long bones scattered around the beach. Thinking of these long bones gave him an idea how he might attend to the spot. Rising smoothly to his feet, the brass man turned and walked away from the ocean toward the wall of trees growing 100 paces from the water. At the base of one of the overhanging trees, he leaned over and began to brush away at the sand. After a few moments, he uncovered a large, long, white bone. Walking carefully back across the sand, since he was also very mindful of the condition of the bottom of his feet, he sat back down. At this point, the brass man moved into new intellectual territory. In all the time he had been here, he had never thought of trying to deal with the spot in this manner. Picking up a piece of metal wool, he carefully wrapped it around the end of the bone. Holding the bone out in front of him, he studied the wool and confirmed that it was secure. Pointing his new tool with its abrasive passenger over his shoulder toward the sun, he raised his elbow in an arc, thus bringing the wool down to touch the spot. He moved his arm up and down, causing the wool to scrape up and down in the small of his back. For a brass man, it felt very good. As he worked on the spot, the sun continued its travel up over his head and descending back down toward the ocean. Watching the setting sun while he scrubbed the spot, the brass man observed the dark waves as they danced and jumped in the evening light. At this time of day, waves on the surface of the water were an equal mixture of sunlit peaks and dark valleys. To the brass man's mind, this is when the ocean was at its worst. Although he had very little imagination, he often sat here and wished he could swim out into the salty ocean water and use the 4-part procedure to polish the waves, which for a brass man would be very foolish. After the sun set in front of him and rose behind him 2 or 3 times, he decided he probably was doing no good with the spot. Pulling his arm back up over his shoulder, he retrieved the wool from the end of the bone. It was then he noticed a white flag moving toward him from very far off. Normally, he would have spent about 2 milliseconds musing over the motion, considering its implications, judging its range, and about 1 second reaching down beside him, grabbing his laser rifle, and making the object disappear in a puff of smoke. That is what the brass man did, of course. He kept everything off his section of the beach by turning movement into smoke. But for some reason he hesitated. The 2 milliseconds stretched interminably into hundreds of seconds. He had never seen a white flag creature before and didn't realize that there were any around. He had made puffs of smoke out of many things, but never a white flag. It reminded him of the soft white leather that he used in the fourth part of his procedure against tarnish. So he waited, which for a brass man with a penchant for polishing was very easy. The white flag approached, and his vision resolved it into a creature holding a stick which held the white cloth. At first, the creature looked familiar, but as it approached, he realized it was just a rude caricature of a brass man. It had 2 arms and 2 legs, but they were small and spindly. It had a head, but it was an ugly, non-golden color, and was covered with what seemed to be black grass. Its large torso was covered in a material that appeared to be the same as the white flag, only brown. Eventually, the creature moved to within a few steps of the brass man, stuck the flag into the sand, and stopped moving. The brass man mentally wrestled with his instructions. As a compromise, he picked up his laser rifle, pointed it at the middle of the creature's torso. He stopped moving too. After what seemed to the brass man to be no time at all, for the sun had only risen once since the creature arrived, it moved again. The brass man had to go through another analysis period since movement usually resulted in a puff of smoke, but he decided to see it out. The creature raised its hands to a bag tied at the lower portion of its torso. It pulled out a fine piece of cotton and a jar of polishing compound. The brass man's vanity underwent a fierce struggle with his desire to turn movement into smoke. The approximation of a brass man moved away from the setting sun and around towards his brass back. Opening the jar, it reached down and began to polish the spot. The brass man could almost feel layers and layers of tarnish flaking away. He watched the sun drop dramatically into the sea and decided he was glad he had not turned this particular movement into smoke. Then the human pushed its finger into a hole in the middle of the spot and flipped a switch.